Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Wherever you're joining us from, welcome back. Welcome to Light 'em Up. Good to have you all with us. For all our friends and fellows joining us here via the lounge, for everybody joining us over on the YouTube live stream, thanks for chiming in. For those of you who are following on YouTube, please make yourselves heard in the comments. If you have any questions or thoughts that I can forward to Philip, I have the privilege of today hosting with you sort of a virtual tasting and a bit of a history lesson on a specific type of tobacco that is very dear and close to Philip Wynne's heart. Philip has been growing Pelo de Oro for many, many years now in locations and in different growing areas. And I want this to be a part of an ongoing series where we will, over the weeks and over the months, talk about individual tobaccos. We'll talk about origins. We'll try to explore very peculiar and particular aromatic experiences and taste profiles of different tobaccos and tobacco growing regions, origins. And today we kick things off with Pelo de Oro, and who better to have with me to do that than Philip Wynne from Felipe Gregorio Cigars. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today. And I see you were just as eager and excited as I am. I already lit up my Pelo de Oro, and I see you did the same.
Mm-hmm.
You know that I absolutely love this blend, like so many of your cigars. But it's truly a privilege to not only get to enjoy that and share that with our viewers, but to take a little bit of a deep dive and explore more about the history, the origins, and the unique attributes and characteristics of that particular tobacco. So thank you for doing that with us and allowing us the pleasure to learn and enjoy that profile with you.
Thank you, Reinhard. Thank you all who are attending and are listening from around the world. Pelo de Oro is unique in the sense that it is a pure Cuban strain. We can call it an ancestral Cuban strain of tobacco. It was the tobacco grown in Cuba in the 1950s. So basically every tobacco, every cigar that was made in Cuba before of all the variations that came out of the different seed varietals was Pelo de Oro was being used. The reason why it changed is with the advent of the blue mold, which is a strain, a bacteria strain that settled in Cuba and travels from Cuba northwards along the Atlantic coast. So it hits Nicaragua, it hits hits Nicaragua, it will hit Dominican, it goes up Honduras and into the United States. And this strain is very damaging, and the Pelo de Oro is very, very susceptible to this strain. So the Cubans back in the 1950s found that they could not combat the strain with the various fungicides or pesticides they were using, and they decided to start using their research to blend, to make a genetic differences in this tobacco in order to be more resistant to blue molds and other strains. The Pelo de Oro plant, the typology of the plant, it's a relatively short plant compared to the other tobacco varieties out there. It will have basically 5 to 6 primings, and it is a shorter, more robust plant. And as such, it doesn't make a lot of economical sense for many of the growers to grow this variety of tobacco because you do not get the yields that would make it profitable. So for example, for 1 hectare of wrapper grown in Ecuador, you should be able to get around 3,000 pounds optimum of wrapper yield, while with Pelo de Oro you'll be at around 2,200. So that pushes the price up, and it makes it more difficult because as I say, it's very susceptible to different strains. I started growing it in Costa Rica because in Costa Rica we were growing it at an altitude and we were below the famous blue mold. So we weren't affected by that. But then again, the yield wasn't there, and the areas that we were growing on, the acreage or hectarage was not great enough to make it commercially viable. But I started using it on my blends and my smaller productions, and I was making productions between 50 to 100,000 cigars a year. I've since taken this seed and I've adapted it to Ecuador, and now I'm growing it in Ecuador. The varieties have changed a bit because Ecuador, the climatic conditions in Ecuador is more, the sunlight is more diffused, so the wrapper is a slightly bit darker and it is a bit wider in the leaves, but nevertheless, the true taste profile remains the same.
Um, just to go a step back, Pelo de Oro in essence means the hair of gold, right?
Yeah, or yes, yes, or they sometimes call it angel hair as well too.
And from what I understand, for quite many people in the cigar industry, there still seems to be sort of a mystical aura around Pelo de Oro, probably because you really don't see it very often anymore. But also, I would imagine, based on the aromatic attributes and the unique profile that Pelo de Oro can offer, right? Um, one
Well,
other
right
thing
now,
that,
go ahead.
please, sorry.
No, Pelo de, very few people grow. I think I'm probably one of the only ones that are growing the Pelo de Oro wrapper. But there is Pelo de Oro filler being grown. It's been grown in Peru and it's been grown in other places. And the Pelo de Oro filler gives also very distinct attributes to the blend. Pelo de Oro is generally on a Swedish side of sweet, not in terms of sugary, but less bitter than the other tobaccos, and it blends well with a myriad of different components. An interesting note is that the Santa Andres tobacco that's been grown in Mexico, that has been grown there for dozens of years, it was originally a Pelo de Oro plant that mutated to the climatic conditions of Mexico. So Pelo de Oro kind of is like the mother of a lot of the tobacco that we see around that has gone around the world.
That's very interesting. I mean, you and I, we have personally talked about, you know, the, the spread of indigenous seeds or original seeds on various different occasions, and I fondly remember there's an old video of Steve Saka and Nick Melillo, still to be found on the internet when they were both still with Drew Estate, if I'm not mistaken. And they spoke about the original criollos, where the story or the theory goes that you know you had an indigenous seed or an original criollo in the Andes in Peru, and eventually the tobacco made its way from there, spread to as you mentioned, Mexico. Well, first of all, probably Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean islands, up the east coast of the United States, and then, of course, at some point, other origins like Indonesia, Sumatra. Europe, of course, and eventually Africa come into the picture as well. But first of all, do you believe in that theory and how the tobacco blend might have spread? And then I guess there's various different iterations or interpretations as to where did the Mexican seeds originate? Is it its own thing, or is it eventually, you know, a derivative or a sister or a daughter and son seed of, you know, any of the other original criollos?
Um, I believe that is a plausible theory, but I don't believe it's the only theory. Tobacco is indigenous to South America. Now, whether or not the indigenous plant first came from the Amazon basin and then moved up through Mesoamerica, it's very hard to tell. What we do know
Mhm.
is that the Mayan civilization were the first really to be using tobacco in its shape and form. They smoked it and used it for religious ceremonies. The Mayans then traded with the Tainos and the other Indian, native Indian American Indians, and the tobacco started appearing in Cuba in different areas and going up the Mayan Empire, which composed the southern end Honduras and the northern end southern part of Mexico. So I believe that the Mayans and in the Copan Ruin Valley in Honduras, you actually have old Mayan friezes depicting Mayan smoking. So the Mayans are the ones that we sort of get all our modern day knowledge from. Now, whether they got that plant and it came up through the Amazon, it's plausible, but I don't think anyone has really found the origins of tobacco
Mhm.
in that sense. I mean, it's debatable. Then to go on to your talk about Indonesia and the rest of that, remember that when Columbus first came to the New World, and then it was conquered by the Brazilians, and the English came and in the new continent, they were all traders, and the Dutch were looking for products to trade, and they had a small presence in New York, but they weren't in, besides an area next to Suriname and what is now Curacao. They weren't very big tobacco producers, but they're being very good traders and having a very strong foothold in South Africa and what is now Indonesia. They started bringing the seeds there because that they saw the climate was similar and started growing tobacco there. And so the origins of the Sumatra and Indonesian tobacco also came from the Americas. And then
Mhm.
the Spanish did the same with the Philippines, which was its colony, because Cuba was providing a lot of tobacco to the Spanish, and the Spanish saw that the opportunity of growing tobacco in the Philippines and manufacturing cigars there as well.
Before we go any further, briefly talk to us, please, about the cigar that you and I are smoking. Because not only are we talking about a tobacco varietal, a seed varietal that's called Pelo de Oro, but you've had a cigar brand or line of cigars in your portfolio with Felipe Gregorio called Pelo de Oro, which prominently features this particular tobacco.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this brand of mine, which has been in existence for over, I think, must be now close to 18 years that I came out with, is basically a Pelo de Oro puro. Everything in here is Pelo de Oro. So it has a unique taste profile, which is on the milder side, but very velvety, and it has, as you can see, I don't know if you can see it. It has a slow burn. It's smooth, and it's very voluptuous in smoke. So it has a lot of intricacies in the blend that are different from your stronger ligero sun-grown tobaccos. And you taste variances in the flavor, and especially as the cigar burns down, the aromatic oils warm up, and you have different notes that are coming into you. I would say it's. um I hate to always to paragon taste of tobacco to other things because tobacco is unique and it is tobacco, but it would be more of a nutmeggy, a lighter, a coffee cacao type of taste compared to more of your fuller peppery or white pepper type notes that you get in some of the other cigars.
You know what's interesting to me is that even on the cold draw already, the cigar had something that, for lack of better terms, I would describe as kind of an old school profile. It's a certain aromatic quality that reminds me of great cigars from yesteryears, and I know that might be an odd association, but um, I sometimes feel that with your blending style and your cigars in general, there's a bit of a reminiscence of the past, where quite many of your cigars have, to me, a beautiful old school Dominican profile. This is certainly unique in it. and again, it's a term that I don't like to use, but it has a sort of Cubanesque reminiscence with it, where you can find a little bit of those floral, borderline citrusy top notes sitting atop a mellow, slightly sweet, kind of nutty, but very creamy. And you said the word voluptuous. I love that. It has a very velvety, rich, and dense mouthfeel, but all in an elegant and very, yeah, elegant or subtle way. It's not it's not bold or overly rich in the sense that it hits you with a lot of spice, but it's beautifully well-rounded. It has a lot of richness. It has a full mouth feel, but overall in an elegant register overall. Does that make
Well,
sense?
it makes sense. This is my 35th year that I've been making cigars, and I started in the United States in the 1990s making cigars in Honduras, and I blended cigars to what I grew up in Europe, which were the old Cuban cigars. Now, that said, I look for those profiles in there, but the cigar is only as good as the tobacco that you put into it.
Mhm.
There's no other trick to it. There are certain things that you can do in blending that I do, which for once, I invert the leaves in the filler so that the tip of one leaf is on the other side in the bunch. And this being that on the tips of the leaves, you get more of a nicotine concentration. So what I want to do is when you smoke the cigar, I personally have always enjoyed a cigar that is not linear, that changes in its taste. And
Yeah, yeah,
this in this blending process, it allows you to capture that essence. That, and you also, it's very important to really blend and take the time to pick out the filler leaves that you're using. Uh, one of the keys is probably to blend by color, looking for the leaves that are similar in the same color spectrum, so that you don't have some variances in that. Plus, making sure that your volado or the combustion leaf that you have is extremely well fermented so that it holds the whole blend through and it burns at a steady but slow, and that's the key word, slow combustion rate. Because if you burn hot, then part of the leaf and the filler is burning hotter than the other. You gather more smoke. The more smoke you get, the less taste you get in your mouth, and it alters the smoking sensation, in my humble opinion.
very interesting points. Um, would you say that the Pelo de Oro that you grow requires a specific approach during the fermentation, or would you just say it's part of sort of your overall approach to how you ferment tobaccos, but not specifically different for just the Pelo de Oro?
No, there's no specifics in the fermentation. Where the specifics are is in the field. It requires a lot of attention, because, like I say, it is very susceptible, and the plant being low to the ground is closer to all parasites that might be there, snails, things of that nature that might come up the stalk. And when you have less leaves, so you have to be able to really be on it with a crew of people constantly looking at this tobacco, constantly looking. So it's very hard to grow very large expanses of it, because while you're working on one end of if you're working on 1 hectare, by the time you get to the other, it could be too late because you're there a few days later. So you have to be able to do it in small batches, in my experience. Now the filler is different. The filler, since you're not looking, I grow in my plant, I grow wrapper, filler, and binder. So I make sure that my wrapper leaves are prime, and the filler and binder, you don't have to worry as much. There you accentuate the taste in the fermentation process, but it doesn't have to be perfect to the look. If you look at your cigar, this wrapper is golden in the sense, and it's golden. It's not a Connecticut golden. It's a different type of golden, and
Yeah.
this is the characteristic of the Pelo de Oro.
I'm just trying to show it here for the people. I hope you can see it on camera. I think you hit the nail on the head. Besides, the combustion is absolutely gorgeous with a very thin, razor sharp mascara burn line, whitish, very compact ash. But most certainly, we can see that golden hue on the wrapper that you were describing.
For all cigar aficionados, you know, one has to try everything. Cigars, I repeat, and like I've said I think in one of your other podcasts, it's very similar to wine. So you have the different terroirs, you have the different varieties that you're using, and it's the same with cigars. So people that love cigars, uh, can't be married to one type of tobacco. They need to try everything in order for them to get a better palate and a more education on what they really like. Because there are nuances in the varieties of the seed, nuances in the terroir where they're grown, nuances where you smoke it. Like I believe you're in Austria now. You're probably
Mhm.
smoking it's colder and the relative humidity is lower, so the cigar is acting different than me in the tropics. So all of these things make part of the smoking experience. But once you know all of these and you've tasted and you can identify a Nicaraguan grown tobacco or Honduran or a Cuban or broadleaf or a Sumatra from Indonesia, and you know their attributes, then you sort of can put together a sensory palette in your mind
A
of what
database.
tobacco is, you know?
It's like your sensory database that you
Exactly.
put together for yourself, and that's really where you draw inspiration from for whether it's the blending process or the evaluation process of what you're actually smoking and how you try to describe that or make it relevant and understandable for other people as well.
Exactly. One great analogy is that cigar makers are painters. The only thing we don't use color, we use leaves to paint.
Yeah.
So in our palette, instead of putting Titan white and lapis blue or ochre to make a canvas, we're working with leaves. But these leaves have color. These leaves have texture. These leaves have veins. These leaves have all of these variables that only experience can let you know what you're dealing with. It's very hard to learn this from a book. It's very hard to learn this by looking at pictures. You have to touch and feel. Any of my peers that are cigars maker, they can blindly, without looking at any tobacco leaf, touch it and tell you right there and then, sensorily, whether that leaf will be good to make a cigar with. And then they can look at the leaf and they'll say, because we'll feel the oils, we'll feel the stickiness, we'll feel the heft of the leaf. So it's all a process that one learns, and it's a continuing knowledge that's coming about. I'm still learning today because
Mhm.
I hear things, I see things, especially in the field.
Philip, talk to us a little more about the history of Pelo de Oro, please. You mentioned that it used to be one of the predominant Cuban seeds as far back as the 50s. Um, Obviously, at at some point, the economical considerations start to kick in, and people now have obviously hybridized for resistance, for yield. But as we also know, is that whenever you try to play with Mother Nature a little bit, or whenever you're trying to alter what's the most natural state and form of a product, eventually you might jeopardize or lose certain characteristics in terms of aroma and the taste profile. That's the same with the wines, as you also mentioned. It's another thing that you see with tobacco varietals, no question. Um,
But you
but
can also gain, Reinhard. You can also gain. It's not only negative because a
mm,
lot of these experiments have come out and they see that they're bringing something more to the tobacco, right? So
because
the
using your analogy,
mm,
it's like you suddenly create a different color. You maybe start to mix reds and blues, and
mhm,
you suddenly have a vibrant lilac or
mhm, mm,
violet to paint with as well, right?
mhm. Right.
So yeah, that's a fair point.
So Pelo de Oro, they in the 50s the Cubans were growing this. They were growing it in the main areas of tobacco areas, which is the Pinar del Rio and different areas in the Cuban. This was the predominant strain of tobacco. In the 50s, remember, it was Cuba was private. It wasn't the Fidel Castro hadn't come in yet, and there wasn't a communist government system where everything belonged and there was one manufacturer making everyone. So all the different growers were growing the best possible tobacco that they could because they had to work with the economic variances of supply and demand. And many of these growers were at the same time a cigar makers. So they were used to this tobacco and they grew it and they knew it. And that is that when you say you smoke this and you taste that old school Cuban taste, that is because this has it in its DNA.
Yeah.
The problem is that when the blue mold hit and this tobacco wasn't susceptible, the Cuban, as a young communist country, they didn't have the financial wherewithal or the desire to spend money on the field. So they use their Institute of Tobacco, which is very good, to try to find a tobacco that could resist blue mold and could give more of a yield and make more tobacco per the acreage because that and sugarcane was their two cash crops. So they needed to produce more cigars. And the Pelo de Oro, unfortunately, for the reasons I told you before, being a shorter plant, did not give them the yield they wanted. So then they
Yeah.
started inventing and they started coming out with the Havana 2000, 98s, and all the different seeds of varieties of Cuban tobacco. But remember that the Cuban tobacco, it's all comes from one mother. So if you imagine one great, 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 great grandmother and all these different children all over the world, that's what you have. But it came from one parent originally.
How do you feel that, or how quickly do you feel that a certain type of tobacco, a certain seed starts to become adapted to its natural habitat or to the terroir? Because I think that you can argue once you grow a specific type of tobacco um, under specific terroir conditions, over time, the terroir aspect starts to also creep into the picture and eventually possibly overshadows the
It
initial
does. It
attributes
does.
of the seed that you're working with.
It does. I would say 10 to 12 years. 10 to 12 years, with 10 to 12 crop rotations. Because what happens is when we grow, we grow, and then we look for the most resistant and the most beautiful plants that we have. And those ones we don't take off the flower. We keep it for seeds. So this process goes from crop to crop, from year to year, and we're getting the best, the best, the best for that climatic variety that we're looking for. And then in the end, it becomes unique.
Mm.
It's something that probably holds maybe 30% of what the original attributes were of that original seed. And that you'll find it everywhere, as you're seeing in Ecuador, they're growing what they call Cameroon. But
Mm.
Cameroon, as you know, is a variety of Sumatra. So the Sumatra that was grown in Indonesia is different than the Cameroon, which was the Sumatra plant grown in Cameroon, and now to the one that's growing in Ecuador. But that shows that illustrates what a terroir can do, and also the fermentation techniques of the different countries, especially in the barns, in the way they ferment it, they dry the tobacco, how they dry it, if they dry it in larger tobacco barns or in ranchos like in the Dominican Republic, or if they dry the whole plant like they do in Cuba. In Cuba, they take the whole plant and they dry it. They don't take primings. And so everyone has their own way of doing things, and that influence ultimately on the taste of the cigar, of the tobacco that you're smoking.
Philip, when was the first time that you actually came across Pelo de Oro yourself?
I came across it. There was a gentleman by the name of John Vogel, and John Vogel was the head of the research and development, the genetic lab of what was then Consolidated Cigar. Consolidated Cigars invested a lot in genetics, a lot. And he, uh, throughout his tenure there, isolated what he called ancestral or pure seeds. And he was the one that kept them throughout time because tobacco seeds, I don't know if the public that you have there, they've actually seen a tobacco seed. Tobacco seeds are minuscule. I mean, in a thumbnail, you could have hundreds of thousands of plants. So it's very easy for the seeds to be mixed with other seeds. And so I've personally seen in the Dominican, in the field on one tobacco plant, a, a Piloto Cubano leaves and Olor Dominicano because the plant had been, contaminated with the two seeds, and it grows like that. So in order to keep them clear and to keep them refrigerated and to identify them and to go through that process is a tedious researching job. And this gentleman was an expert at this. And he gave me I bought from him actually a number of what we call ancestral Cuban seeds. Pelo de Oro being the one that I like the most. There was another one that I've tried with, which is called cola de gallo, which means rooster tail, because the end of the leaf is split. It doesn't come to a point. And I've tried these varieties, and I hold these seeds, and for me, that's my they're in my safe. That's my gold, So that's how I first came in touch with those.
And then the majority that you grew was in Costa Rica, as you mentioned, at a very
I
high
started in
altitude.
Costa Rica. Yeah, I started in Costa Rica, and then I used it. I took the mother seed. I did various. I did two parallel programs. I took the seeds that I had evolved from Costa Rica, planted them in Ecuador, and alongside that, in the same field, I planted the original Pelo de Oro. And I saw how I didn't make any cigars on it at that point. I just saw for two times that we did it. I just saw how these plants were growing and progressing, and then I used the seed of both of them to make the the third variant of Pelo de Oro, which I'm now growing in Ecuador.
What were the differences that you saw when you did those experiments side by side?
Height, color, and weight of the leaf, the heft of the leaf.
Thickness, like texture.
Thickness,
Right?
yeah.
And which one did you ultimately prefer, or would you say they were just different? It's hard to say which one you like better.
Well, I merged the two. I,
Mm.
I I crossed the two, and that's the one that I'm growing now.
Costa Rica, obviously, that chapter is closed. Um, the original Pelo de Oro cigar you had was in that sense, was a Pelo de Oro Costa Rican Puro, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
How was it different once you had the then crossed Pelo de Oro grown
They're
in
very
Ecuador? How
similar,
would you
Reinhard.
compare it to Costa Rica?
It's very similar. The wrapper in Ecuador is slightly lighter, while the Costa Rican one was tended to be a more have more reddish hues on it. But on the other hand, the Costa Rican one gave a stronger, to lack of the better word, a stronger filler leaf than the Ecuadorian one. That's
Mhm.
because of the direct sunlight that is hotter there, and the direct sunlight on the leaf made the nicotine more prominent.
Can you describe a little bit the process of when you grow the tobacco that's designed to be wrapper versus what you use for filler? And I guess binder is usually what was supposed to be wrapper but didn't quite make it in terms of sorting,
It, it,
either
it's it,
because
it's
there's
it's based
imperfections in the leaf or
Yeah, it's basically the size and the primings of the plant. I would say that what we call the third, fourth, and Corona primings you use for wrappers, and the other primings you would use for a filler. And but in those wrapper primings, the ones like you say that have certain imperfections, we use for the binder, and we will ferment that tobacco longer than we would ferment the wrapper variety of it. So that the tobacco, the leaf tends to be darker and it tends to have more oils in it because of the fermentation that we give it.
So in essence, what you're saying is that you're not separating the growing operations for,
No,
in this plot of land, you're growing for filler versus the rest, which is supposed to be wrapper, right? Because
it all
I
comes from
think
the
that
same plant.
a lot of tobacco people, they specifically grow certain lots, which are meant to be optimum yield for wrapper in that sense, right? And
You'll
then
see
you have
that with
other,
shade grown tobacco mainly, but
of course.
all sun grown tobacco is similar to me too. A lot of people use the same system that we do. It's the primings. Remember that no plant, no tobacco plant, let's say of the 16 leaves that it produces, are all good for. They can all be used for wrapper. None, nowhere in the world. There's all going
Of
to be
course.
some imperfections and there's going to be differences. So what happens to that tobacco? That tobacco has to be used for binder and filler.
Mhm.
The thing is, the optimum thing is that you pick an area where you can get a larger amount of better primings for the wrapper because you can sell the wrapper at a higher price. So that's what the farmer looks for. So if I can do, I'm at around 60% of my yield goes to wrapper. But if I could be at 70, I'd be a much more wealthier man. But it's just the realities of what you have to do with Mother Nature, you see.
Mhm. Good point. And and also, I mean, there's this sort of traditional concept of when you create the blend, then you use Secco Viso Ligero as sort of the building blocks for your blend, right? Is that purely because of economical reasons for those
No,
particular
no, no.
matters?
When
Of
you
course, you
when
also take into consideration the combustion, which you need to balance all these things. You need to balance the nicotine strength. You can't just put Ligero in the cigar and expect it to burn beautifully and taste right. But is there an economical consideration in that formulation as well?
No, the economic consideration is always there as a tobacco, as a cigar maker. But I mean, you need very few people can survive on a volume of making a puro because you don't have the quantity of tobacco. So you need to buy and blend with tobaccos also because the market demands that. So a look in the last years, the growth of Nicaraguan tobacco. People love that Nicaraguan tobacco. So a lot of Dominican people are now using in their blends a Nicaraguan Ligero or Viso because they want to bring up the strength profile of their Dominican cigar. Because if they only used Olor, they would not have that. And so goes if you want to do the opposite. The Nicaraguans have a very strong tobacco. If they want to mellow it down a bit, they're going to need to bring in a wrapper from another part of the world and maybe a binder. If you're looking for pure economics of scale and you're making a lot of cigars, you look for the least expensive, which now the prices of worldwide of tobacco have gone up, so you really can't equate to that. But before, there was a tobacco called M1 or Visuki from Indonesia, which was the way they fermented it was perfect and it was inexpensive, and many people used it as a binder and as a wrapper because it came out perfect and it lowered the cost per cigar because they could buy that and they could know that the yield of that burlap bag that they bought of 100 pounds, the yield was 90%. So they knew their money was well worth it now. Now with the advent of the Chinese coming into the market, a lot of that tobacco is not available. The Chinese have bought it out, and unfortunately, the Chinese have yet to learn how to blend the cigar, so it's being wasted. Or I don't know if they have it in warehouses, but a lot of people have had to find alternates to that tobacco of the smaller manufacturers. Remember, the bigger manufacturers all probably have an agreement with growers that they've been working with for over decades, and there's a huge relationship there. So their tobacco is sourced and their tobacco is known. So they have not many variables. When the variable comes in is when they want to make something different, and let's say we want to try something different. Let's use an Aripiraca from Brazil to give it certain notes. Let's use a Matafina. All of these give different things. All of these tobaccos, like from the terroir and the variances of the seed, give different flavor profiles. So people use them, and that's where the art and the mastery of blending is, because no two people blend the same.
Very true. So when you started growing Pelo de Oro and you started to formulate the blend for the cigar that you and I are smoking at the moment, how did you approach balancing out all the various different components that make the overall blend? The leaves you put in the filler, the binder, the wrapper,
Well,
given
this
it
is a
all comes from the same
Th-
plant.
This
It's a
is a this is
puro.
a this is a puro. This is a puro. So a puro is, from the it's the same tobacco. So it's there. I'm just blending on the different primings. I'm using a ligero
Yeah.
that it's my ligero that I've kept on the stalk of the plant longer, so it gets more nicotine. I'm using my binder. I'm using my viso. I'm not so it's not that hard. It's not that hard. It's just a matter of choosing the tobaccos that I want to use for my particular cigar. And it's a lot. In Pelo de Oro, I only have two sizes because I don't have the quantity of tobacco needed to make a whole portfolio of sizes. Plus, I figured out that the 50 and the 54 ring gauge are the best that works for me. I can't go with more bigger ring gauges because I don't think it would work on the blend. Plus, it would use up a lot of my tobacco, and I would have to make less cigars. So these are all things that one has to balance when you're making a puro.
So in this case, it's maybe less accurate to say blending. It actually comes down to positioning the leaves, positioning the different primings in the bunch so that you can ensure um, a precise and accurate combustion,
That's
correct?
correct.
Because,
That's correct.
yeah.
That's correct. In the case of a puro,
What were to happen if you were to take that and blend it, let's say, in a Lancero to go the extreme, or in a Lonsdale, even a Corona Gorda, where you go drastically below that 50 ring gauge. Um, how do you think the tobacco would express itself differently, given that you taste more of the wrapper leaf? So you probably end up tasting more of a different priming, even though you're using the same tobacco. But have you played with that, and how would you feel
yeah,
it would
I
alter the
make them.
overall
I make them and I
experience?
smoke them myself. The best ring gauge for a cigar is a 42. 42 to 44, because then you have the dimensions, the proportions between wrapper, filler, and binder, because you're using basically six leaves, are perfect. You use two, two, and two. The wrapper, binder, two, two, and so that's the perfect. But again, the market the market is not conducive to those ring sizes. Used to be.
Mhm.
The market now wants bigger ring sizes, so one has to sacrifice a bit of taste for more smoke, which is what the market wants.
Good question. Good point. Question from both Ian and then also Albert just put some questions in the chat. Ian, we'll start with you, and then Albert, please chime in.
Really enjoying the information. And it's a point I think well, Reinhold mentioned it, and I'd never really thought about it, that binders are often sort of the things that didn't quite make the grade to be filler. But I want to comment on the debate about whether you get most of the flavor from a cigar from the wrapper or from the filler, or not at all, and also no difference. Or if the binder is also really effectively filler, does that also not have a huge effect on the overall taste of the cigar?
The binder is basically a wrapper that didn't make it, not filler.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
that's what I meant. I
yeah,
thought I said that. That's what I meant.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It makes a huge difference because to give you an example, if one most mass-produced cigars in the past were made with that Visuki, that M1 Sumatra that I was talking to you about. That tobacco has a very predominant metallic taste. I'm sure you've tasted cigars that have a metallic edge to it. So no matter what tobacco you use in the filler or the wrapper, the predominance of the metallic will overpower everything else. So there's no point putting a very aged, subtle tobacco with that type of binder because, or that wrapper, because the predominant taste will be so overpowering. And then the other way around, if you use a Nicaraguan ligero or a double ligero, again, it will overpower the wrapper and the binder. So that's what you will taste. So all of those things are what you need to work with.
I think you mentioned that you ferment the binder a bit longer. How does that affect the flavor relative to the filler, which is not fermented for so long?
No, the filler is fermented as long. I was mentioning that in relation to my Pelo de Oro that I'm making as a puro. That I
Uh-huh.
mentioned that, but I mean, binder and filler usually are fermented along around the same time. It's the wrapper that's always fermented less.
So to come back to my original question about the filler and the binder are going to have the same effect on the overall taste because they're often they're very similar in the fact there's a few holes in the binder is not going to make any difference to its taste.
No, not at all. And remember, I would say probably maybe the wrapper, depending on the wrapper, gives 30% of the taste. The rest is filler and binder.
But isn't the binder also then going to be getting on to 30% because it's a similar size to the wrapper?
Yes, yeah. Well, the 30
Okay, a
depends.
little bit less. It's a bit
A
smaller.
little bit
Yeah.
less, a little bit less, yeah.
Thank you.
Generally the wrapper and binder are two different varieties of tobacco when you're not doing a puro. So
Thank you.
let's say when you have a Connecticut seed, that is really being used for aesthetics more than for taste, because it's got a silky sheen, it's flawless, very small veins, but it doesn't give much in terms of a taste profile. So that wrapper doesn't really. If you make a cigar with a lot of Nicaraguan tobacco and you put a Connecticut shade wrapper on it, you're basically tasting just the Nicaraguan tobacco.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, Phil, in the case of the puro here, it's basically the primings that will also define how much impact the three components have, right?
Correct.
Because you don't put the ligero as your wrapper, you put it in the filler,
That's
and
correct.
and then you choose a lower priming for the wrapper. Also, that the cigar
No,
has
a higher primer for the wrapper,
okay.
a higher primer.
Do you also use ligero in the filler then for this
Yes,
particular one here?
yes, but the ligero is probably the top leaves that are too small to be used to wrap the cigar.
Understood. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Albert, over to you. Please chime in.
Oh well, uh, Philip, thanks for coming on the panel. That's really insightful information that you're sharing here, and it's like it's for some people it's plugging gaps in the knowledge. For some, it's completely new knowledge. But I just had one question, and it's actually quite easy question for you. Should be, but I assume. So imagining that I would create a medium blend, some sort of like medium-bodied cigar, and I would go for Honduran filler, Dominican binder, well, for that subtle sweetness, and then Brazilian Maduro wrapper. Would that work?
I think there are probably cigars out there that are made with that blend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Brazilian wrapper is very hard to get. There might be some, before it was more common, there was the only Brazilian wrapper in the sense is Arapiraca. And Arapiraca is a chocolatey brown wrapper, and it was used commonly, but right now it's very hard to find. They're not growing it that much. But yes, it would work. Basically, whatever you put in a cigar will work. It depends on whether you like it because everyone's taste profile is different. What I'm trying to tell you is that you don't use a predominant tobacco with weaker tobacco. So if you want to get a lot of flavor, different flavors, you can't use in your blend a cigar that will overpower those because you won't taste that. But if you use tobaccos that aren't so strength with that have notes, those pungent notes, strong notes, and the best always to come to mind, the easiest to paragon is a ligero from Nicaragua, which I'm sure all of you have smoked, and you know it has a characteristic. Now, if I were to blend a ligero puro, it'd be very hard to smoke because it'd be very strong. So,
Yeah.
but by blending it with Dominican tobaccos or with Hondurans, you're bringing down the intensity and you're producing another sheen or another layer to the savory sensations that you have in your mouth.
Oh, that's a very solid answer, and I just poking around with this answer. I recently was in Nicaragua and visited factories, and I just popping that question to almost everybody, and it's, to my surprise, a lot of people come up with a different answer, but
Hmm.
actually, all of them say that you going for Brazilian wrapper, that's an expensive choice. Like if you ask to make that cigar, the quantity is not gonna be huge, or the price will gonna be astronomical. So and just as a touch point on, you mentioned that the best ring gauge that you think is it's like what 42, 40, 44. Wasn't that the old school Cuban ring
Yeah,
gauge back in the
that
day?
was the classic Corona size. That's what everyone used to smoke.
Yeah,
And also
okay.
remember, back in those days, people would smoke 3 to 4 cigars a day. And so it was an easier cigar to smoke because you'd have one in the morning, one after lunch, one in the afternoon, and one for dinner. And it just only afterwards that different sizes became trending. And there are different, I guess, for regional preferences. I mean, maybe Reinhardt can chime in too, because I know, I mean, the Churchill was created because that was the size that Winston Churchill liked, because he would smoke a cigar generally with a big snifter of brandy, and he wanted a cigar to last. Whilst the Spanish would use the cigar in between meals, and so they didn't want a long smoke. They wanted a 20 minute smoke. So it all became what regional preferences was. Then the Americans came along, and the Americans, we always believe bigger is better or more for the buck. And that's
Go
kind of the
big or go
mentality.
home.
Yeah.
Go big or go home.
So the popularity of big ring gauge cigars, 56, 58, 60, 62, because they say, well, if I can get a 60 ring gauge cigar and it costs me $1 more than a Corona, I'm going to buy that, and it gives me more smoke. I got more tobacco. But in the end, they don't realize that they're really not tasting much more. They're tasting more smoke, more oxygen.
Yeah, we're not getting more of a premium tobacco.
No.
Or I would say more expensive because wrapper is the most expensive. So, yeah, makes sense. So anyway, I got that right. So I'm happy with that answer. So thank
Cheers.
you, thank you again.
Philip, the cigar has a beautiful evolution. It still kept its sort of original core profile, where you have some of that elegant sweetness, you have a little bit of these nutty qualities, and still on top it has some bright top notes, which gives some zing and excitement to the blend, which I really like. There's clearly an evolution, and the cigar picks up in terms of intensity and
Hmm.
richness as it
And a bit
progresses.
of strength too.
Yes,
Yeah.
but still in a very well behaved
Mm,
manner, I
mm,
would say.
mhm.
How is your experience when not creating a puro out of Pelo de Oro, but using it as a component in other multi-country blends?
Oh, I'm a fan. You know, Pelo de Oro is one of my favorite tobaccos. So, and the Pelo de Oro coming out of Peru is amazing. And there's a lot of manufacturers that are using that blend, and they put a
Is
leaf.
that
They
grown
put
by Gennaro?
yes, yes,
Or
yes, yes, yes. But it's very, very good, very good. It has a lot of taste, a lot of taste, and but no, not overpowering. So I like that. I like that. I like a lot of Corojo tobaccos personally. I think bring a lot to the table, and some Havana varieties. The older Havana varieties that were grown in Central America, Havana 92, which was grown in Nicaragua and Honduras, had certain qualities that were incredible, very chocolatey. So it changes all the time, Reinhard. But I mean, I would, if I were to only make one blend, I would definitely, my two favorite tobaccos for blends are Pelo de Oro and, believe it or not, a Brazilian tobacco called Matafina.
mm,
Those are my Philip's personal favorites.
great to hear. Good to know. Actually, we'll have Gennaro at some point very soon to join us for a tasting of Peruvian tobaccos. Also, Gennaro and I we exchanged a couple of samples of little fumos of various different tobaccos that he
Mm-hmm.
grows. So we have already planned and we're in the final stages of scheduling another one of these tobacco tasting sessions with him. And
That'd be
I'm
great. And I
super
think you're
curious.
you're you're doing a great job because you're educating, because the more, it would be interesting also to get an Indonesian producer in, or to get
Mhm.
bring in someone from Mexico, it's fascinating because everyone brings an ingredient into the recipe. And the
Very
recipe in
true.
the end is a pleasure bomb for all of us to enjoy.
Well, speaking of Mexico, I was just speaking with Alejandro Turrent earlier today, and we did the same. So I'm also sitting on a whole bunch of tobacco samples from Alejandro from Mexico. So as I said, I want this to be an ongoing series where we can do a tasting of different tobacco origins, different seed varietals, and I've already realized, and clearly I think that's the journey of most people once they start diving into tobaccos. Um, you're never getting answers. All you get is more questions because it opens a beautiful can of worms where with every discovery there's a million new questions you have to ask, and that's fascinating, and it just goes to show the incredible depth and complexity of the process and the final product.
Yeah, yeah, and then if you ever want to do a series on growing, just growing, you have a Pandora box of things. I once mentioned to you how the bees influence the growth because they pollinate the flower. So if your tobacco plantation is next to a pineapple farm, or next to something else, that influence the taste of your tobacco because the pollination of the flower is coming from that. And there's so many variables, Reinhard, so many variables. In the old
Yeah.
days, we used to put a cotton seed. We would plant it next to the root ball of the plant, so that the oil of the cotton seed would give a sheen and give more oils to the tobacco leaf. So
Wow.
there's so much in there. I mean, it's for another show, or more than one show.
But look, I mean, clearly, I think there's also a reason why so many wine growers and wine producers have gone back to full organic growing, where they have a plethora of different plants all grown in one vineyard, not just exclusively
Hmm.
vines, but all sorts of plants, whether that's peach trees, which are very common here in Austria in the Wachau region, roses that are usually grown somewhere in between the vines as well. It just adds to the variety, and the magic and the beauty of Mother Nature with everything that you can grow there and how these plants positively affect each other.
Yeah, And you know that the wine growers, some of the better ones, they plant roses at the end of each row of vines, because if they see that the rose is being eaten up is more susceptible to parasites, they can see that and they can tell
You know, you have
that
an issue.
you have an issue. So there's so many complex ingredients to this.
Philip, a quick question on the seeds, because one thing that it reminds me of always is in Kentucky, for example, for a lot of the bourbon distillers, their strain of yeast is is their gold. It's what they keep in their fridge. That's their bank deposit, and it's one of their most valuable assets. Similar to when you were talking about those seeds, the original seeds that you had gotten from John Vogel.
Mm-hmm.
How long can you keep these original seeds? I guess when you keep them in a fridge, they're probably stable for a very long period of
Yes,
time.
yeah,
But
yeah.
how do you manage that, and how do you keep that?
Well, you have the fridge is crucial. You have to have them at a certain temperature and a certain humidity, and you keep them. But you can't. You always need to replenish them. So if you have a seed bank that you're using, you would take some of that seed and grow it out and replenish it with new seed from the flowers that are coming out from the macho plants, to use a term, the better looking plants that you have, and you take that and you replenish your seed bank. But I mean, you can keep easily 10 to 15 year seeds easily
Would they
in
ever
in a,
deteriorate or
no, no, no,
change their
no, no.
characteristics and
They're
quality?
dormant. It's dormant.
Very interesting. Well, it's a fascinating learning experience, truly, and such a beautiful learning journey. So I'm very grateful that you share so much of your experience with us.
Well, I'm next time, uh, what I'd like to do, and it's on me, but we have to plan it with time, because only you and I are enjoying the cigar right now. I would love all your guests to be able to see what we're talking about. So let's see in the future if I can host and give you some cigars, or we can mail them to the people that are going to be on the panel, and that would make it make more sense to it, because then as we're talking, they can see what we're talking about.
Absolutely. We'll make it a point that for our mailing list, we start announcing a show with probably a couple of months time notice, so that we can just plan and make sure that whoever wants to be a part of that experience
And
sort of
I'm sure
signs
you'll
up
have more
for it, and
listeners.
we send the cigars.
I'm sure you'll get more listeners as well, probably once they know that they'll be getting a cigar to try.
Well, we always share the information and this as much as we can with everybody. So yeah, this has been a fabulous learning experience, truly, and what a beautiful cigar. So again, I know that we
Thank
get
you.
everybody envious, and everybody's probably licking their lips, hoping for a gentle taste of hopefully whatever beautiful cigar you have in your hands. But this has been phenomenal. So
Well, thank
kudos
you,
to you,
thank you,
Philip.
thank you, thank you all. Huh? It has been my pleasure, and it's always an honor to talk about tobacco. And I'm always here for any questions that you might have. I'm always here to answer them.
Thank you so much, Philip. It's been an absolute pleasure. A deep dive on Pelo de Oro today. Plenty more to come. And next week we'll do something similar but slightly different. We'll have Claudio Scroy joining us. And Claudio and we've been exchanging samples of different primings. So next week we want to focus on the different experience of going through secos, visos, ligeros, and evaluating the different tobaccos in form of a little fumo, a little purito, but going through the different primings. So please chime in
That
next
will be
week for,
fascinating. That
for
will be
another tasting
fascinating.
session. And after looking at a specific seed varietal and specific origin today, we'll do primings next week. So please join us again, same time, same
Thank you,
station.
everyone.
Philip Wynne,
Bye-bye.
thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. It's been a
Bye-bye.
privilege. Goodbye,
Bye-bye.
everybody, and
Bye-bye.
light him up, everybody.
Excellent.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Very informative. Nice job, Reinhardt. That was great.